It begins with silence. Christmas Eve, 1969. The port of Cherbourg, France. A light snow is falling on the cobblestones. Wreaths hang from iron lampposts along the quay. The harbor is dark, the water black, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell is counting the hours toward midnight. Inside a secured naval yard at the edge of the port, 5 warships sit moored at a main pier. They are sleek, fast, and lethal by design, missile boats of the Tsar class, built to the precise specifications of the Israeli Navy. Their hulls have been repainted in French naval gray. Their Israeli flags have been removed, but they were bought and paid for, every franc of them, by the government of Israel. France refuses to hand them over, and on this particular night, Israel has decided it is done asking. What is about to happen is not a heist in the Hollywood sense. There are no masked men, no cracked safes, no getaway cars idling in the alley. What is about to happen is something more complicated, more consequential, and in many ways more revealing. A sovereign government authorizing the covert extraction of 5 warships from the harbor of a Western ally, using a network of forged identities, ghost companies, bribed dock workers, and a carefully chosen holiday window when French military and intelligence services would be operating at reduced capacity. Within hours, those 5 ships will be moving north through the English Channel at full speed, running without authorization, without weapons, and without enough fuel to reach their destination, without a covert resupply stop. They will face winter storms in some of the most dangerous waters in the Atlantic. They will be tracked by the French Navy, watched by Soviet submarines, and monitored by Spanish and Moroccan patrol boats. And they will make it. This is Operation Noah, the night Israel stole its own navy back. But to understand why this happened, why a government made the calculation that stealing warships from an ally was preferable to continued diplomacy, you have to go back. Back to a desert war in June of 1967, and the moment France decided that Arab oil mattered more than its oldest Middle Eastern partnership. In the spring of 1967, Israel was facing what its military planners genuinely believed was an existential threat. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had blockaded the Strait of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern port at Eilat and effectively strangling its Red Sea access. Egyptian armored divisions were massing in the Sinai. Syrian forces were positioned on the Golan Heights. Jordan's army was mobilizing along the West Bank frontier. Soviet-supplied missile boats were operating off Israel's Mediterranean coast. The Israeli Navy, for its part, was in no condition to respond. Its fleet consisted primarily of aging destroyers and patrol vessels left over from the Second World War. Ships that were hopelessly outclassed by the Soviet-equipped navies now arrayed against it. Israeli naval strategists had reached a stark conclusion. Without a modern missile boat fleet, Israel's entire coastline was exposed. Ports could be blockaded. Offshore infrastructure could be destroyed. Enemy vessels could operate within range of Tel Aviv with virtual impunity. In an era of precision-guided munitions, maritime superiority was no longer a strategic luxury. It was an existential requirement. The Israeli government turned to its allies. Britain declined. The United States, calculating the political risk of alienating Arab oil producers, offered little beyond symbolic assurances. France, however, said yes. This needs context. Under President Charles de Gaulle, France had been Israel's most important military supplier throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. French Mirage jet fighters formed the backbone of the Israeli Air Force. French tanks and artillery equipped Israeli armored divisions. The relationship was built on the cold logic of mutual interest. France needed export markets for its defense industry. Israel needed weapons, and it had survived multiple shifts in regional politics. The two countries had even cooperated in the 1956 Suez Campaign alongside Britain. In 1965, Israel signed a contract with Constructions Mécaniques de Normandie, a French shipyard in Cherbourg, for the construction of 12 fast attack craft of the Tsar class. These were not patrol boats. They were high-performance offensive platforms armed with Gabriel surface-to-surface missiles, torpedoes, and rapid-fire cannon, capable of engaging enemy warships at extended range, patrolling contested waters, and sustaining independent operations for extended periods. The contract was worth tens of millions of francs, paid in advance by the Israeli government. Construction began in 1966. Then came the Six-Day War. In June 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan that destroyed the Arab air forces on the ground in the first hours of fighting and, within 6 days, resulted in the capture of the Sinai Peninsula, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. By any military measure, it was one of the most decisive campaigns in modern warfare. For Israel, it was survival. For France, it was a diplomatic catastrophe. De Gaulle had privately warned Israeli leadership not to strike first. He had positioned France as a neutral mediator in the region, a counterweight to both American and Soviet influence, carefully cultivating relationships with Arab governments alongside its partnership with Israel. Israel's preemptive strike, whatever its strategic justification, obliterated that posture overnight. France was humiliated. Its influence in the Arab world was damaged, and de Gaulle was furious. On June 2, 1967, days before the war actually began, de Gaulle imposed an arms embargo on Israel. French weapons deliveries were halted immediately. Spare parts for Mirage fighters were withheld. Artillery ammunition already contracted was seized. And the 5 SAR-class missile boats currently sitting in Cherbourg, paid for, tested, and ready for delivery, were frozen in port. France would not release them. The Israeli government protested vigorously through diplomatic channels. These were not gifts, they argued. These were purchased property, delivered under a legally binding contract. France's refusal to release them amounted to breach of contract and, arguably, theft of sovereign property. Israeli diplomats pointed out that the embargo applied retroactively to agreements already executed and already paid for, that Israel was effectively being punished for successfully defending itself against the threat of annihilation. French officials responded with the language of neutrality. The embargo applied to all parties to the Middle East conflict. They said, it would remain in place until a comprehensive peace agreement was reached. The boats would stay in Cherbourg. This documentary does not glorify the use of covert force. It examines how governments reach the decision that the mechanisms of law and diplomacy have failed, and what they do next. Behind the diplomatic language, however, was a harder political reality. France under de Gaulle, and later under Georges Pompidou, was in the process of reorienting its Middle East policy away from Israel and toward the Arab world. Arab oil, Arab markets, and Arab political leverage had become more valuable to Paris than the strategic partnership with Jerusalem. The SAR boats were no longer simply a contractual dispute. They had become a bargaining chip in a larger geopolitical realignment. For Israel, the embargo was a crisis that went far beyond 5 ships. The French military partnership had not been peripheral to Israeli defense, it had been central. French Mirages were not one option among many. They were the Israeli Air Force. Without French spare parts and munitions, the operational readiness of Israel's entire military would degrade within months. The country had staked its defense architecture on a supplier that had just walked away. The SAR boats, representing years of planning and tens of millions of dollars in prepaid contracts, were now sitting 40 miles from the English Channel, legally owned by Israel, and entirely inaccessible. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol authorized a covert extraction plan. The problem was making it work. Cherbourg was not a remote colonial outpost. It was a major French naval installation, a strategic port with active military infrastructure, Coast Guard patrols, naval intelligence monitoring, and regular security sweeps of the shipyard where the SAR boats were moored. Simply ordering Israeli crews to start engines and sail would trigger immediate pursuit. The French Navy had both the capability and the authority to intercept vessels leaving without clearance. The operation required two things working simultaneously: a plausible legal pretext that would allow the boats to be prepared for departure without alerting French intelligence, and a departure window timed to minimize the response capacity of French authorities. Both problems were assigned to Rear Admiral Mordecai Liman and, working alongside him, the Mossad. Admiral Liman was an unusual choice in the most practical sense. He was already there. He had overseen the SAR boat construction program from its inception, traveled frequently to Cherbourg to inspect progress, and maintained working relationships with French shipyard officials. He knew the boats intimately, their mechanical systems, their navigational equipment, their fuel capacity, their operational range. He knew the harbor layout, and he understood that extracting 5 warships from a hostile port was not primarily a military problem. It was an intelligence problem. The Mossad's assignment was to construct the cover story, the operational fiction that would buy time for the actual extraction to be prepared. What they devised was elegant in its audacity. Israeli intelligence would create a fictitious Norwegian company expressing commercial interest in purchasing the embargoed SAR boats. The company, given the name Starboat, would present itself as a legitimate maritime enterprise seeking patrol vessels to protect oil platforms in the North Sea. It would be registered in Oslo, maintain offices in London, and its board would include Norwegian businessmen recruited by the Mossad who genuinely believed they were facilitating a real commercial transaction. The financial backing would appear to come from Scandinavian shipping interests. In reality, every document, every bank transfer, and every correspondence in the Starboat file was orchestrated by Israeli intelligence. The logic of the deception was sound. France was stuck with 5 expensive warships sitting idle in a harbor, generating political embarrassment and no revenue. Selling them to a neutral third party, a Norwegian oil company with no connection to the Arab-Israeli conflict, would solve the political problem without technically violating the embargo's spirit. France wouldn't be arming Israel. It would be selling patrol boats to Scandinavia. Starboat contacted the French government in mid-1968. French officials were receptive. Negotiations began. But French intelligence was not naive. Background checks on Starboat flagged inconsistencies almost immediately. The company's financial history was unusually thin for an enterprise claiming to represent major shipping interests. Several board members had indirect connections to Israeli business concerns. The corporate structure had the quality of something assembled quickly, with paperwork that was too clean in some areas and too sparse in others. The Direction du Renseignement Militaire, French military intelligence, began increasing surveillance of the Cherbourg shipyard, looking for signs of Israeli agents operating in the area. Admiral Liman was simultaneously preparing the actual extraction. He could not simply wait for the Starboat transaction to conclude. French intelligence might expose the deception at any moment. The boats had been sitting idle for months. Their engines needed testing, their navigation systems calibrated, their fuel tanks quietly topped off. He needed Israeli crews in Cherbourg, familiarizing themselves with the vessels, conducting maintenance under cover, and remaining ready to depart on short notice. Israeli naval officers began arriving in Cherbourg in small groups through late 1968 and into 1969. They entered under assumed identities as engineering consultants, inspection technicians, contract workers. They lived in separate hotels, avoided any visible contact with one another, and moved through the port as ordinary civilians. Their actual work was systematic, learning every mechanical system on each of the 5 boats, assessing what repairs were needed, and rehearsing the choreography of a simultaneous departure. French yard workers were told the boats were being prepared for eventual delivery to the Norwegian buyers. The explanation was plausible. The preparation was real. But French naval intelligence was watching, and by October of 1969, intercepted communications indicated that Israeli agents were operating in the Cherbourg area. Surveillance of the shipyard intensified. Time was running out. If France moved to permanently impound the boats, or if French counterintelligence unraveled the starboat fiction before the extraction was ready, the mission would fail. Lyman made the decision to accelerate the timeline. The extraction would happen in December, during the Christmas holiday period, when French military and intelligence operations would be running at minimum staffing. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The calculation was precise. French naval personnel would be on holiday leave. Harbor surveillance would be minimal. The weather forecast called for heavy storms in the English Channel, a serious hazard for small, lightly crewed vessels attempting a winter Atlantic crossing, but also a natural deterrent to Coast Guard patrols. The storm was both a danger and a shield. 5 Israeli crews, approximately 120 men in total, would board the boats under cover of darkness. They would start engines simultaneously and exit the harbor without authorization or filing a departure notice. By the time French authorities understood what was happening, the boats would be in international waters, beyond France's legal authority to stop without triggering a full diplomatic incident. The route was planned in detail. North through the English Channel, then west into the Atlantic, south through the Strait of Gibraltar, and east across the Mediterranean to Haifa, roughly 3,200 nautical miles, approximately 2 weeks of sailing. The boats carried no weapons. All missiles and torpedoes had been removed as part of the embargo. Fuel reserves were minimal. Covert resupply stops had been arranged through Israeli contacts in Portugal. Navigation would be done by dead reckoning and celestial observation when cloud cover permitted. GPS did not exist. Radio silence would be maintained throughout. Admiral Lyman briefed the crews himself and did not minimize what they were facing. This was not a sanctioned military operation with air support and escort vessels. There were no friendly navies in the channel. If French forces intercepted them in French territorial waters, the crews had no means of resistance. If a boat suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure mid-Atlantic in a winter storm, rescue would be uncertain at best. If the operation failed, if any boat was forced back to Cherbourg, or if French diplomatic pressure forced a halt, the consequences would include criminal prosecution, a permanent rupture in French-Israeli relations, and the probable end of any future weapons cooperation with Western European nations. He asked if anyone wished to withdraw. No one did. On the afternoon of December 24th, the final authorization came through from Israeli government leadership. The operation was cleared. That evening, as French families gathered for Christmas Eve, dinner, and midnight mass, Israeli naval officers moved quietly toward the shipyard. They carried forged French worker identification. They wore civilian clothes. They entered through different gates at staggered intervals, pairs of men drifting through a harbor district that smelled of snow and wood smoke, where cafes played Christmas music, and the security posture of the port was, for once, relaxed. The 5 boats lay moored in a line along the main pier. French guards conducted sporadic patrols, but their attention was not sharp. It was Christmas Eve. The harbor was quiet. At 10 p.m., Israeli crews boarded all 5 boats simultaneously. The movement was practiced and efficient. Engine rooms were activated. Navigation systems came online. Mooring lines were quietly loosened, not yet cast off, but ready. The plan required all 5 boats to depart at the same moment, reducing the window available for a coordinated French response. At 10:30 p.m., Admiral Lyman gave the order. 5 SAR-class missile boats came to life. Their high-performance marine engines, designed for combat pursuit, built for speed, tore through the silence of Christmas Eve with a sound that could not be mistaken for anything routine. Mooring lines were thrown clear. The boats reversed from the pier, turned toward the harbor mouth, and accelerated. French guards on the pier reacted immediately, but reacted to confusion as much as to crisis. The boats were moving without authorization. But whose boats were they? Israeli property? Norwegian property? The legal status was genuinely unclear in that moment. Radio calls went out to French Naval Command, but it was Christmas Eve. Duty officers were attempting to reach senior commanders. The chain of response was slow to form. By the time a coherent order could be issued, the boats had cleared the harbor breakwater and were running north at full speed into dark, churning water. The French Coast Guard dispatched patrol vessels. They were overmatched. The SAR boats were designed specifically for pursuit and interception. They were among the fastest small surface combatants in the world. Nothing the Coast Guard had available could close the gap. The Israeli crews pushed the engines hard and ran north through the darkness. At French Naval Command, the debate was urgent, and the options were poor. Jet aircraft could be scrambled. Fast attack boats could be vectored toward the fleeing vessels. But what then? Opening fire on unarmed ships in international waters was an act of war. Boarding them on the high seas would be a violation of maritime law that France itself could not defend internationally. And the political calculus of killing Israeli sailors on Christmas Eve, the images of that, the headlines, was catastrophic to contemplate. The decision was made to pursue, but not to intercept. France would watch. France would protest. France would not shoot. For the Israeli crews, the immediate tactical danger had passed. What replaced it was something more elemental. 5 small warships in a North Atlantic winter storm, running without weapons, with minimal fuel, into 6-meter swells and driving rain. The SAR boats had been designed for Mediterranean operations. They were not ocean-crossing vessels. Waves broke over the decks continuously. Crew members who had never experienced Atlantic conditions were seasick and struggling to maintain station. Navigation was conducted by dead reckoning, tracking speed, heading, and elapsed time to estimate position, with brief celestial readings taken when breaks in the cloud cover allowed. Radio silence held. Each boat operated independently, following the agreed route, with no communication between vessels. The first resupply stop, a remote Portuguese harbor where Israeli contacts had pre-positioned fuel, was critical. Without it, the boats could not reach Gibraltar. Mechanical problems threatened to abort the mission before they got there. One boat's engine was running hot. Another had developed hydraulic issues. Crews worked through the night in near-freezing temperatures, making emergency repairs on open decks while the Atlantic heaved around them. They made it to Portugal. On December 27th, the boats passed through the Strait of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean. Weather conditions improved marginally, but new threats materialized. Spanish and Moroccan patrol vessels monitored the convoy with visible suspicion. Soviet submarines, whose movements Israeli naval intelligence was tracking, were in the area. The boats maintained radio silence and communicated only through prearranged light signals. In Paris, the diplomatic explosion had already begun. President Georges Pompidou, who had succeeded de Gaulle earlier that year, demanded explanations from the Israeli government. Israel's ambassador in Paris denied any knowledge of the operation, maintaining the fiction that the boats had been legitimately sold to the Norwegian company Starboat, and that their departure was a commercial matter. The French government contacted Oslo. Norwegian authorities, who had been unaware that they were participants in an Israeli intelligence operation, responded with a combination of bewilderment and anger. The Starboat deception was unraveling in real time. The international press reached the story within days. Headlines described the operation variously as an audacious heist, a maritime escape, an act of piracy. Legal scholars debated whether Israel had violated international law. Diplomatic correspondents predicted a permanent rupture in French-Israeli relations. The French foreign minister summoned the Israeli ambassador and delivered what observers described as one of the most severe rebukes in recent diplomatic history. The boats kept sailing. On New Year's Eve, 1 week after leaving Cherbourg, the convoy had crossed the eastern Mediterranean and was approaching Israeli waters. The Israeli Navy prepared a reception. Combat aircraft flew cover for the final miles. Israeli Navy ships came out to escort the Tsar boats home. On January 4, 1970, all 5 Tsar-class missile boats entered the port of Haifa, battered, their hulls marked by the Atlantic crossing, but intact. Admiral Lyman stood on the deck of the lead vessel as it docked. By the accounts of those present, he did not smile. The mission had succeeded. But he understood, with the precision of a man who had planned every hour of it, exactly how close it had come to failing, and what the accounting of consequences had not yet been completed. The 5 ships had come home. The bill for bringing them home was still being calculated. The boats were home. But in the language of intelligence operations, getting out clean and getting out without consequences are 2 entirely different things. Israel had the ships. France had the humiliation. And the world now had a question it didn't quite know how to answer. When a government decides that international law has failed it, what does it do? And what does that decision cost? The diplomatic fallout came fast, and it came hard. Within weeks of the Cherbourg departure, France expelled Israeli diplomatic personnel from Paris. Arms contracts that had survived the initial 1967 embargo, spare parts pipelines, technical cooperation agreements, maintenance protocols for French-made equipment already in Israeli service, were permanently annulled. The French government issued a formal declaration that it would never again supply weapons to Israel under any circumstances. The relationship that had armed and sustained the Israeli military through the founding decade of the state, through the Suez Campaign, through the military buildup of the early 1960s, that relationship was finished. President Pompidou was characteristically cold in his public statements. France had been deceived, he said. Its sovereignty had been violated. A fictional Norwegian company had been used to defraud the French government in a transaction it had entered in good faith. The Star Boat deception was not merely an embarrassment. It was, as French officials framed it, an act of state-sponsored fraud perpetrated against an ally. The Israeli government's response was calibrated. Officially, it maintained the position that the Tsar boats had been legitimately transferred to a private commercial entity, and that the decisions of that entity were not the responsibility of the Israeli government. No one in Jerusalem believed this would be taken seriously. The point was not persuasion. The point was the creation of enough diplomatic ambiguity to prevent the incident from triggering a formal rupture at the United Nations or prompting legal proceedings in international forums where France might seek to have the boats impounded. It worked, barely. France protested. France fumed. France did not take the matter to the International Court of Justice, in part because its own legal position was not as clean as its rhetoric suggested. If Israel had paid for the boats in full under a binding contract and France had refused to deliver them without legal basis, then the embargo itself, retroactively applied to contracts already executed and already financed, was of questionable legality under international commercial law. French lawyers understood this. The political embarrassment of a legal challenge that France might lose was not a risk Paris was willing to accept, so the matter settled into a state of unresolved tension that would define French-Israeli relations for the next decade. Not formal hostility, not reconciliation, a cold and practiced distance. But to understand what Operation Noah actually changed, not in the short term, but structurally, doctrinally, over the arc of decades, you have to look at what happened to those 5 ships after they arrived in Haifa. The Tsar boats entered Israeli naval service in 1970. Within months of their arrival, They were armed with a weapons system that would itself reshape the doctrine of naval warfare, the Gabriel surface-to-surface missile. Developed by Israeli defense engineers in the years following the Six-Day War, the Gabriel was a sea-skimming anti-ship missile designed specifically for the close-range, high-speed engagements that characterized Mediterranean coastal warfare. It was accurate, it was fast, and it could be fired from a small, fast attack craft, exactly the kind of platform that the SAR boats represented. The combination was decisive. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack against Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, when Israeli military preparedness was at its annual low point. The attack caught Israeli forces unprepared on multiple fronts simultaneously. In the Sinai, Egyptian armor poured across the canal. On the Golan Heights, Syrian tank columns pushed toward the Jordan River. Israeli casualties in the first hours were catastrophic. At sea, however, the story was different. The SAR boats, the same 5 vessels that had slipped out of Cherbourg 3 years earlier, met Syrian and Egyptian naval forces in a series of engagements that became some of the most studied events in the history of modern naval warfare. In the Battle of Latakia, fought off the Syrian coast on October 7th, Israeli SAR boats, armed with Gabriel missiles, engaged a Syrian naval force that included missile-armed Soviet-built vessels. What followed was the first naval battle in history in which both sides deployed anti-ship missiles. The Israeli boats won decisively. Syrian vessels were sunk or disabled without a single Israeli casualty. In subsequent engagements along the Egyptian coast, Israeli missile boats repeated the performance, intercepting Egyptian naval forces, destroying or disabling enemy vessels, and securing Israel's maritime flanks during the most dangerous military crisis the country had faced since 1948. The Yom Kippur War ended with Israel's survival intact, at terrible cost. The contribution of the SAR boats to that survival was not marginal. They had secured the coastline. They had prevented Egypt and Syria from establishing maritime dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. They had demonstrated, in live combat, that a small nation with advanced weapons technology and disciplined crews could achieve naval superiority against numerically larger opponents. Think about the chain of decisions that led to that outcome. The SAR boats existed because Israel had the foresight in 1965 to contract for modern missile vessels. They were available in 1973 because Israeli intelligence had the audacity, in 1969, to extract them from Cherbourg rather than accept their permanent confiscation. And they were effective in 1973 because Israeli engineers had developed the Gabriel missile as a direct response to being cut off from French weapons technology. The French embargo intended to constrain Israel. It ended up accelerating the development of Israeli military independence. This is the pattern that runs through the history of the Cherbourg affair, and it is a pattern worth examining carefully because it reveals something about how strategic decisions actually work, not as they are intended, but as they propagate through time. When de Gaulle imposed the embargo in 1967, his calculation was geopolitical. France needed Arab goodwill. Israel's military success had made it a liability to French regional ambitions. Cutting off weapons to Israel was the price of reorienting French policy. It was a rational decision by the logic of great power management. What de Gaulle did not calculate, what no one in the Élysée Palace appears to have calculated, was that forcing Israel to develop its own defense industry would, within a decade, transform Israel into a significant arms exporter. The lesson of the French withdrawal was not that Israel should find another patron. The lesson was that Israel should never again be dependent on any patron. By the late 1970s, Israel was producing its own combat aircraft, the Kfir, derived from the Mirage airframe but redesigned with American engines and Israeli avionics. By the 1980s, it had developed the Lavi fighter jet program, a project of sufficient sophistication that the United States, concerned about competition with its own defense industry, pressured Israel to cancel it. Israeli-developed Merkava tanks were operational. Israeli missile systems were entering service. Israeli naval architecture had advanced to the point where the country was designing and building its own surface combatants and submarines. None of this would have happened on that timeline, if at all, without the shock of the French embargo. The Tsar boats were not only warships, they were the catalyst for a strategic decision that transformed Israel's entire relationship to military production and technology transfer. But this transformation had a darker dimension, and responsible analysis requires acknowledging it directly. And Israel, with an advanced and expanding defense industry, needed markets for its products. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Israeli weapons and military assistance reached governments and armed factions that Western nations officially refused to supply, including, controversially, apartheid South Africa, various Central American regimes during the Cold War proxy conflicts of that period, and other actors whose human rights records were deeply problematic. Israeli officials defended these relationships on the grounds of national security necessity and the logic of reciprocal arrangements. Critics argued that Israel was exporting the consequences of its own experience of abandonment, that having been refused weapons when it needed them, it had made a policy of refusing to ask too many questions about the intentions of those who needed weapons from it. The Cherbourg affair did not cause any of this, but it accelerated the conditions that made it possible. The legal questions raised by Operation Noah were never formally resolved, and the ambiguity is instructive. Consider the structure of the dispute. Israel had signed a contract with a French shipyard and paid in full. France had imposed an arms embargo that retroactively prevented delivery of goods already purchased. Israel had then used a network of deceptions to recover property it argued was legally its own. Was this theft? The standard definition of theft requires taking property belonging to another. Israel's position was that the boats belonged to Israel, that France's refusal to deliver them was itself the unlawful act, and that Israel was recovering its own property, not stealing France's. French courts never adjudicated the question. International tribunals were never asked to rule on it. The matter existed in a legal gray zone that neither party had the incentive to resolve through formal proceedings. This gray zone is not an accident of the specific facts. It is a structural feature of the international system. The legal architecture governing state behavior, the United Nations Charter, the Geneva Conventions, the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic Relations and Treaty Law, was designed to regulate relations between states that are willing to submit to its authority. When a state concludes that submission to that authority is incompatible with its survival, it exits the system. Not formally, not permanently, but operationally, for the duration of the crisis. What Israel did in Cherbourg was not unique in the history of statecraft. What made it distinctive was the precision of its execution and the clarity with which it exposed the gap between the formal rules of international relations and the actual behavior of states under existential pressure. The French government understood this gap, even as it protested. Privately, French military officers conceded, according to later accounts from former officials, that the operation was technically brilliant. A small country had run an intelligence deception of considerable sophistication, used the holiday calendar as an operational asset, exploited France's own legal uncertainty about the boat's ownership, and extracted 5 warships from a guarded installation without firing a shot or injuring a single person. The protest was mandatory. The grudging admiration was real. What about the Mossad's role? The full architecture of the starboat operation was classified for years. When details began to emerge, through memoirs, through investigative journalism, through the gradual declassification of documents in the 1980s and 1990s, the picture that assembled itself was considerably more complex than the simple Norway cover story. Israeli intelligence had not merely created the starboat facade. It had simultaneously planted disinformation suggesting the boats were being sold to South Africa, a separate false lead designed to create confusion within French counterintelligence and split their analytical attention. Israeli agents in Cherbourg had bribed shipyard workers to delay reporting the boat's departure to the harbor authorities, extending the window before French Naval Command received coherent information. Israeli naval intelligence had been intercepting French communications in the Cherbourg area, giving Lyman's team advanced knowledge of Coast Guard patrol patterns and response protocols. The operation, in other words, was not a single deception. It was a layered architecture of deceptions, each designed to fail safely, to provide a fallback story if one layer was penetrated, without exposing the layer beneath it. This is the operational signature of mature intelligence tradecraft. The Mossad in 1969 was not yet the organization it would become by the 1970s and 1980s, when its operations would grow both in ambition and in controversy. But Cherbourg was evidence of a service that had moved well beyond the improvised methods of Israel's founding years. The sophistication of the financial structure, the multi-layered deception, the precise exploitation of institutional vulnerabilities in French bureaucracy, these were not improvised. They were the product of systematic planning and deep operational knowledge of the target environment. Several of the Israeli agents involved in the Cherbourg preparation never spoke publicly about their participation. Others wrote memoirs decades later that revealed, in careful terms, the texture of the operation without fully disclosing its most sensitive dimensions. What emerges from these accounts collectively is a portrait of sustained stress, months of maintaining covers in a country whose intelligence service was actively looking for them, preparing ships for an operation that could not be discussed openly, running communication protocols designed to be deniable if intercepted. One recurring element in these accounts is the near miss, the engine that ran hot on the crossing and nearly had to be shut down, the Portuguese resupply contact who almost failed to appear. The moment when French Coast Guard radio traffic suggested an intercept was being organized before the transmission turned out to be unrelated. The operation succeeded. But the margin between success and catastrophe, as its participants described it later, was considerably narrower than the clean narrative of professional execution suggests. The crews of the 5 SAR boats became legends within the Israeli Navy. Their operation is taught at Israeli naval academies as a case study in what the institution calls _0_0_. The doctrine that when conventional options are exhausted, the measure of institutional character is the quality of the unconventional ones. Admiral Lehmann retired with distinction. He rarely spoke publicly about Cherbourg, preferring, as one colleague described it, to let the record speak without embellishment. In private conversations toward the end of his life, he acknowledged that the operation's success had depended on a factor no planning could guarantee: the French decision not to escalate. Had a more aggressive commander been on duty in Cherbourg that night, had a French patrol vessel attempted to board one of the SAR boats in the channel, had a French aircraft been ordered to force the convoy back to port, the outcome could have been entirely different. Lyman had calculated that France would not shoot. He had been right. But the calculation had not been certain. This is the honest interior of covert operations, and it rarely makes it into the official versions. The gap between the boldness of the planning and the fragility of the execution. The role of luck alongside the role of skill. The decisions that worked because an adversary made the wrong choice, not only because the plan was sound. For France, the Cherbourg affair settled into the national memory as an episode of institutional humiliation. A state whose intelligence services prided themselves on sophistication had been outmaneuvered by a country a fraction of its size. The post-mortem within the Direction du Renseignement Militaire and the SDECE, France's external intelligence service, was, by later accounts, thorough and uncomfortable. The starboat deception had worked not because French intelligence was incompetent, but because the operation had been constructed specifically around French institutional vulnerabilities, the tendency to treat commercial transactions as lower priority intelligence targets, the reduced staffing of the holiday period, the legal ambiguity of the boat's ownership that made French officials hesitant to act. The Cherbourg affair contributed, in ways that are difficult to measure precisely, to a reassessment of French intelligence methodology in the 1970s. French services became more attentive to the activities of foreign state-owned enterprises operating in France, more systematic in their analysis of cover companies, and more alert to the use of third-country nationals as cutouts in intelligence operations. The deception that worked in 1969 would have been harder to sustain a decade later. This is the adaptive dynamic at the heart of all covert operations. They work once, and then the adversary learns. The specific technique becomes obsolete the moment it succeeds. What survives is the principle, the understanding of how institutional vulnerabilities are identified, exploited, and closed. The 5 SAR boats served the Israeli Navy for more than 2 decades. They participated in every significant Israeli naval operation from the Yom Kippur War through the Lebanon conflicts of the 1980s. They patrolled the Mediterranean, interdicted smuggling routes, enforced maritime blockades, and, perhaps most importantly, provided the doctrinal foundation for the development of a larger and more capable Israeli surface fleet. By the early 1990s, they were being retired, replaced by more advanced vessels, incorporating lessons learned from their operational service. The last of the original Cherbourg boats left active service quietly, without ceremony proportional to its history. Their physical legacy is largely gone, but their strategic legacy persists in forms that continue to shape the modern Middle East. The Gabriel missile, developed and deployed in direct response to the French embargo and first used in combat by the SAR boats in 1973, became the ancestor of a family of Israeli-developed weapons that have influenced naval armament design globally. The doctrine of missile boat warfare, validated by the Yom Kippur battles, influenced naval procurement decisions in dozens of countries. The concept of the fast attack craft as a primary surface combatant, small, fast, armed with precision missiles, is now standard doctrine in multiple Mediterranean and Middle Eastern navies. The Israeli defense industry that grew from the shock of the French embargo is now one of the world's most significant exporters of military technology. Systems developed because France refused to supply parts have ended up, in various forms, in service with the militaries of countries on every inhabited continent. The original act of French strategic self-interest, cutting off Israel to preserve Arab goodwill, generated consequences that were almost precisely the opposite of those intended. Which brings us back to the central question that Operation Noah poses, not as history, but as a problem of governance. What does a state do when it concludes that the international system has failed it? When contracts are not honored, when allies withdraw, when the mechanisms designed to regulate the behavior of powerful states prove insufficient to protect smaller ones? Israel's answer in 1969 was to exit the formal system temporarily and solve the problem through covert action. The boats came home. The diplomatic relationship was damaged beyond repair, but a relationship that had already been severed by the embargo was not much further damaged by the Cherbourg operation. The military capability Israel needed was recovered. The precedent, that Israel would take extreme measures to secure its defense requirements, was established clearly enough that no subsequent Western supplier needed to test it. But this answer came with costs that are rarely examined alongside the operation's tactical success. The willingness to operate outside the formal system, to treat international agreements as negotiable when national security is at stake, does not remain contained to the specific instance. It becomes a template. The logic that justified Cherbourg in 1969, that formal mechanisms had failed, that covert action was the only available remedy, That the stakes justified the risk was the same logic applied in subsequent Israeli operations of considerably greater lethality and considerably more contested legality. Not because Cherbourg caused those operations, but because it established and validated a doctrine of state behavior that has no natural limiting principle. This is the unresolved tension at the heart of the Cherbourg affair, and it is not a tension unique to Israel. Every state that has ever used covert force to solve a problem that diplomacy could not faces the same structural question. At what point does the exception become the rule? At what point does the logic of survival, invoked legitimately in crisis, become the routine justification for actions that the formal system would not permit? France never answered that question. It protested, withdrew, and eventually moved on. The international community watched, debated, and moved on. Israel integrated the boats into its fleet, fought a war with them, and built an arms industry from the precedent they represented. The gray zone remained gray. Decades later, the Cherbourg affair sits in an awkward position in the literature of covert operations. It is too successful to be a cautionary tale and too ethically complex to be a straightforward celebration. The men who executed it were not villains. The state that authorized it was not reckless by the standards of the crisis it faced. France's behavior was, by any reasonable commercial standard, a breach of its obligations. The operation that recovered the boats was disciplined, minimally violent, and, in purely operational terms, a masterpiece of integrated intelligence and military planning. And yet the world that emerged from it was one in which the informal precedent had been set, that states facing existential pressure will not be constrained by the formal system when they believe the formal system has failed them. That embargoes will be circumvented. That covert action will fill the space that diplomacy leaves empty. That the boats, whatever the legal status, will find a way home. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is an accurate one. The Saar boats completed their service and were decommissioned. The Cherbourg Harbor looks the same as it did in 1969. The French shipyard where they were built has been absorbed into larger industrial structures and produces different things now. Admiral Lyman is gone. Most of the men who sailed those boats out of the harbor on Christmas Eve 1969 are gone. What remains is the question they left behind, unresolved and still operational. Not just in the Middle East, but in every corner of the world where powerful states impose constraints on smaller ones, and smaller ones conclude that the cost of compliance exceeds the cost of defiance. When the formal mechanisms fail, when the contract is not honored, when the ally withdraws, when the law offers no remedy, who decides what comes next? And who bears the consequences when that decision, however necessary it seemed at the time, turns out to have changed the rules for everyone?